Hello and welcome to this presentation of the Zionsville Airport Area Strategic Land Use Plan. This plan is intended to cover the area surrounding the Indy Exec Airport, provide a future land use plan for that area. My name is Corey Weitzel. I'm with HWC Engineering, and I've been part of the team that has helped prepare this plan along with Mead and Hunt. The content that we'll be covering in this brief presentation is a little introduction, background into the plan. We'll talk about the existing conditions and future conditions at the airport, look at land use analysis and how that impacts future recommendations, and then get into what those future land use recommendations are. Then we'll also include some of the policy recommendations that will influence this area, and then look at next steps. Very specifically, this planning presentation is intended to help solicit input from the public so that you're informed and can provide us input on how this plan can best serve the community. So recognize that the plan is a draft and that we are looking for input into how to make it better serve the community. This plan is a little bit of a unique approach, which is that it's jointly commissioned by both the town of Zionsville and the Hamilton County Airport Authority. And that joint effort was intended to protect the future use of the airport, the current and future use of the airport, but also find an appropriate mix of compatible development that can occur around the airport within the town of Zionsville. We want the plan for this area to find a way to integrate it into the overall community in ways that support community development, quality of life, and economic development goals. Ultimately, the idea is how do we make this work for everyone that's using this area so that the airport continue to be the economic engine that it is for the community, but that growth and development can continue to occur where is appropriate and compatible. The process for this effort started back in the fall of 2018. It has involved a slow and deliberate process to make sure that we've taken our time to come up with the right recommendations, carefully think them over, and get input throughout the process. It started with input from airport stakeholders at the very beginning of the planning process. There's been a steering committee that's met periodically through this time. Stakeholder presentation was held in May to introduce those around the plan to the recommendations. And now we're putting this draft plan out for public input. So let's start by talking about the airport analysis. And to begin, we need to look at existing conditions. So the airport operations are centered off of State Road 32. There's an existing runway that runs between State Road 32 and generally County Road 200. The existing runway does have runway protection zones at the north and the south ends, and those are areas that are intended to remain clear of obstructions, and that's mandated by FAA for safety of those on the ground as well as for aircraft. Now, the long-term future of the plan, there was an airport master plan that was done several years ago, and that airport master plan has a series of future improvements. Most pressing of those is the phase 1 runway extension, and that is planned to be constructed in the next 3 to 5 years. Longer term, that runway would extend again by about 700 feet to the south, and then there would be a future crosswind runway. The phase 2 runway extension and the crosswind runway are items on the master plan, so the airport is required to protect areas for those, although there are no plans to enact those in the immediate term. Looking at the airport, it's important to look at flight patterns, and we'll start with a graphic on the right. To orient you to this map, this is 421 and this is 32, and the blue line here in the middle is the existing runway. The purple is the general aviation pattern area for the airport. Key thing to understand here is there's an instrument landing at the airport, which means that most aircraft are approaching from the south to the north. Aircraft coming from the north are generally following 421, and over the Brookhaven-Fieldstone area is generally where they make the turn to follow the instrument landing to the north. There are also patterns depending on a number of issues that would take aircraft to the north as well as extending around. Get an idea how that plays out with traffic. There was a study that was done of flight patterns in the area. So 32, 421, and this is 200. About right here is where the airport runway is. And you start to get a little bit of a feel for how much of an area is covered by different traffic patterns from the airport, and extends well out into these areas surrounding the runway itself. As you plan for airport, there are a series of surfaces that are prescribed by FAA, and there are different protections for each one of those surfaces. The map at the right represents what those surfaces look like in plan, but realize these are a three-dimensional pattern, much like a contour map. We won't go into the details of what these surfaces represent today, but recognize that at the public meeting, there will be officials there who can answer those questions into more detail. Understand in each one of these areas covered by the surfaces, there are different rules and regulations that apply to those areas. For reference on this map, again, here is the existing runway. This is 421, and about here is County Road 200, and then about here is 32. So using those surfaces, those are what is used to define what the study area for this plan was, because we wanted the study area to be defined by which areas have regulations imposed on them by FAA for the protection at the airport. You can see that those surfaces extend out well past 421 to the west and actually extend outside of the town of Zionsville to the north and extend into Hamilton County to the south, and even with the instrument landing, those areas extend well into Marion County. Can't cover all of that, so the idea was to take areas that were undeveloped in the rural service district of the town of Zionsville and a little bit here at the north and cover those as part of the study area, with the most of the emphasis being on the undeveloped areas that are in the rural service area for the town of Zionsville. As we look at what is happening within those surfaces within the study area, it's important to understand what are compatible land uses within these areas. What are we trying to encourage, and then what things may not be compatible with an airport? So some of the key considerations to think of is tall structures, large trees, are things that are generally not compatible with airport operations. We want to be careful of density. We want to be careful of concentrations of people, assembly uses, things like churches or schools or theaters are generally not compatible. Noise sensitivity is an issue. Users that are very sensitive to the presence of noise and even a little bit of vibration are not generally users that we want to see real close to an airport. Visual obstructions are obviously an issue, and then wildlife attractants. Birds and aircraft are not real compatible. So the table on the right provides a little bit of breakdown of what does that mean in terms of uses. So commercial uses are generally considered complementary unless there's a heavy concentration of people. Most industrial, especially light industrial, is compatible. As soon as you get into work that produces steam, light, glare, those can create conflicts with airport operations and should be discouraged. For residential, we do find that some types of residential are complementary. Townhomes, apartments, mixed density residential, as long as they're in moderate amounts, can be compatible as long as those users are not real sensitive to some of the considerations on the left, especially the noise considerations. What we generally find is single-family suburban style residential is not necessarily compatible with airport operations, much of it due to the noise sensitivity. Agriculture is generally, and throughout this area, considered a complementary use. And then on the flip side of that, kind of the polar opposite, assembly uses generally are not considered to be compatible. So let's look at the existing land use in this area and understand how that impacts future planning. So land use for much of the study area was actually based on the county zoning. When this area came into the town of Zionsville, the existing zoning from the county was grandfathered in for the area. And that has served as both the existing land use plan as well as the future land use plan of this area. This now starts to give us the opportunity to look into what that should be in the future and update those previous plans that have been developed by the county. Existing development does influence what happens in the future as well. And so we've shown in this graphic, again, let me orient you to this. This is 32, this is 421, and then the orange area is the existing boundaries of the airport, so the runway is here. You'll see this general map show up and again over the next several slides. The areas in dark gray are existing subdivided land. So we know those areas have already been developed. And you start to see how much of this land is undeveloped that we need to plan for. As we look at environmental conditions, there's several things that influence this area as well. The areas in light blue and dark blue are the floodplains and floodways associated with Eagle Creek. You also see on here, and some of those are also wetlands. The green areas, the dark green, are trees and other vegetation, forested areas. Many of these forested areas could become forested wetlands because of their location within the Eagle Creek watershed. It is possible. The dark brown area here is a former Superfund site that has a cleanup plan in place. And again, the orange is the airport. The key things to understand as we look at the future of this area is understanding how infrastructure would support or impact development. And sanitary sewer is a key factor. Looking at the area in blue, this area is served by Trico. Part of the area has already been developed and sewer infrastructure is in place. And so because of proximity to existing infrastructure, there's short-term potential for these areas to be developed, the ones in blue. This is generally south of County Road 200 and east of 421. Areas to the north of this, up to State Road 32, are in a different service territory. They're in HSE utility service territory. There's currently no utility that is being provided to these areas. There's no sewer in this area. They are covering it by their jurisdiction. The closest sewer is in Westfield, which is several miles away. So it's a longer term proposition to see these areas north of 200 to be developed. For example, the infrastructure at the airport is generally served by on-site septic systems instead of a public sanitary sewer area. Development within this area that is shown here in the darker green is therefore a longer term proposition until utilities can be extended to the site. We'll come back to this in a little bit and cover how this impacts the site. One of the things that's really important as we look at this, in sewer is one of the driving factors with this, is what are current land use policies. And two that are really important to the town and the patterns that have been developed is to generally grow radially from the village. And what that is trying to do is a logical and linear development pattern that does not skip development in its process. So as the town grows, it's sought to grow radially from the village in a uniform pattern, but it's also sought to discourage leapfrog development, where you develop one area, skip a few fields, and then develop another property on the line. That creates sprawl and is not necessarily recommended. One of the real challenges for this site is that sewer, if it's extended, is likely to be extended along the State Road 32 corridor first for this area in green. That means the airport would be the first area served, but that would leave a long area back to other areas that would be conflicting with this. It would not be growing radially from the village and would be promoting a leapfrog development. But there is some real value in extending utilities to the airport first and revisiting these policies accordingly for this specific area, much because of the existing sewer conditions and the opportunity that exists by getting utilities to the airport and some of the lands around the airport. Again, we'll come back to this in a few minutes. So let's talk about land use recommendations that the plan makes. And these are really the key items that are in this plan. It really comes down to this map of identifying what those future uses would be. We'll go through what all these colors represent on the map over the next few minutes. The most important things to understand from the beginning: this is State Road 32, this is 421, this is 200 South, and then the runway for the airport sits about right here with that blue area. So let's look at these different colors one by one to understand them. The first area are these areas in green. I've put red boxes around them to help show that. These are open space districts. And what these represent are areas where, for both current and long-term future needs and uses of the airport, where low-flying aircraft are possible and protection of those areas from development is warranted. The areas down here that are in green and shaded represent areas where there's already existing development, but they would be places where you would not necessarily want to make uses any more intense than they are now. You would not want to replace a single-family home with a duplex. You wouldn't necessarily want to replace a single-story home with a multi-story home. We want to keep things in a similar area to keep that from becoming an obstruction. The area that is in blue here in the center is the airport as well. Second area of this plan are areas that are west of 421 and generally south of State Road 32. In this case, we want to recommend that this area, about 3,500 acres, is preserved for estate residential and conservation residential. By estate residential, we generally mean large lot residential development. And by conservation residential, where you're not on the largest lots, you're on large to medium-sized lots, we recommend sewer be extended into these areas so that development might be a little smaller in scale, so that it can preserve areas that are sensitive for environmental issues. As much as possible within this area, the forested areas, the wetlands, and the floodplains should all be protected from development, and conservation residential practices can allow that to occur for this area. The next area is the agricultural areas, and these are generally located north of State Road 32. For the short term and the medium term, we certainly recommend those areas remain as agriculture, and to encourage that, we recommend large lot minimums, and so 10 to 20 acre minimum lot size, so it's actually used for agricultural uses and not slowly subdivided out into a series of small residential properties. Long term, this area certainly has development potential, but that would be outside the life of this plan. So we recommend preserving this area as agriculture until it's the right time to develop, and then opening that up. The next area that we're going to come back to is the Airport Village District. And so this is one of the key ideas of the plan, is that there is an opportunity to create an economic engine associated with airport operations through this idea of an airport village. The Airport Village District is based on the idea of an airport city, where the airport city is the development concept that an airport can serve as an economic engine for the greater area around it if you plan those areas out accordingly. And in this area, we see the opportunity to make the airport village a mixed-use center that would have offices, commercial, retail, hospitality-related uses, as well as doing it in a mixed-use fashion that would allow some residential uses on upper stories. This is still moderate in density, looking at no more than 2 to 3 stories for most of it. We are in close proximity to the airport, so we can't get it very high. It allows that unique development to occur in this area and serve as a hub for the greater portion of northern Zionsville. Along with the airport village, the other key recommendation of the land use plan is to create an employment district. So we've recommended a 600-acre employer sites district that would promote really this diverse, well-paying job market that takes advantage of its location near the airport. What that means is you can have airside operations where a business could have direct access to the runway, as well as landside where you're outside the airport fence. what we continue to see is that how do you take advantage of your proximity to the airport? Businesses that are out there doing technology manufacturing, just-in-time manufacturing, where they're wanting to manufacture things and ship them out quickly, this is an ideal opportunity for it. We're seeing this in the medical field, where there are many products that are created that need to be used not in months or weeks, but in hours to get them into different medical centers. And so this is an opportunity to create that type of manufacturing, high-tech, high-paying careers that can be located in close proximity to the airport. We do recommend that there are some places where some housing is feasible. This mixed-use campus housing district is located along 421. And the idea here is to have about 400 acres for mixed-density residential development. This is really envisioned as an attached housing product, really staying low-rise, though, because of its proximity, but it will be mostly residential with some limited use of supporting restaurant or retail or commercial uses. This makes a good opportunity for a senior community or other campus-style housing that could be developed in this area. This property would extend a little bit south of 200 as well. These areas that are shown in the light blue are areas that we're recommending for agriculture use to continue or for agritourism uses. We see these areas as important areas to protect because of the proximity to the airport, but we also recognize that those areas can have a functional use in the agritourism side of it, where that might be UPIC operations or small centers for agritourism use, can really become a viable opportunity within those areas. One of the conversations that's important to point out in this is the area south of County Road 200. This plan does provide some specific recommendations for those future runway protection zones that are south of 200. We know that the extension of the phase 1 and phase 2 runway extensions means that those runway protection zones will extend south of 200. We also know that 200 is the barrier for the upper limit for the Trico Sewer District. So these areas are available to get utilities, and specifically sewer, in the short term, meaning they have short-term development potential. But we also know that if you start to develop this area out, that neighborhoods north of the Brookhaven Fieldstone, those could create conflicts with airport operations. However, some of these areas have already been zoned for residential development by the county, and the town has inherited those zoning and now taking a look at it, because FAA regulations require that the airport has to protect those sites from development. If houses were to be installed, they would need to be removed before the airport could be, the airport runway could be extended. So for that area, the plan that you have seen here recommends continuing to have open space within those RPZs. Right now, it's all open agricultural area. The areas adjacent to that, so the green is where the RPZs would be, and then these areas adjacent would be agriculture or agritourism. While this plan does recommend that as the land use, we do acknowledge that there needs to be additional work to evaluate how to implement that recommendation, and that could be through proactive rezoning or potentially acquisition of that property. Let's come back to policy real quick before we wrap up. Most specifically, let's come back to sanitary sewer. What this plan recommends is to support the extension of sanitary sewer infrastructure into this study area, and specifically along 32 and 421. That would get sewer to the airport. Airport district itself, the airport village district, the employment district, and then ultimately down to the mixed use area. There's tremendous value in getting sewer to this 32 corridor because it would enable expansion of the airport operations. It would enable creation of the village, airport village mixed use district, as well as the employee oversight district. These are important opportunities, and we believe that getting sewer to that area would be the first step. But in doing that, it does violate the town's policies related to, current policies related to development, extending radially from the village and avoiding leapfrog development. In this case, our ultimate recommendation, and as we get into this next step, you see that if you can get it there to 32, get the sewer there to 32, it's recommended that the development grow radially from the village or from the airport / State Road 32 corridor, eventually meeting in the middle. And we think this is a compromise that works in this area. We don't recommend extending this across the town, but for this very specific area, for this reason, we believe that's appropriate. Now, as we do that, that does not mean we continue to or would allow leapfrog development. We still want to avoid leapfrog development in that process as long as you're growing radially from those 2 points, again, either the village or the airport. And then finally, one of the key recommendations of this plan is to establish an airport overlay district, and that airport overlay district would enact the land use and development recommendations that this plan has identified. To wrap up, let's talk a little bit about next steps. There will be an open house on July 28th at 7 p.m. that will occur at the airport. And this will be your opportunity to have questions answered, provide direct input, or discuss the planning topics in more detail. Representatives from the town, the airport authority, as well as the consulting team will be available at that event. We are looking for input, as we've said, and we will take that through August. And then would use that input to put together the draft plan, release that to the public, and go through the full review and adoption phases for the work. To provide input, you can provide that directly to the town or to the director of the airport, the Indianapolis Executive Airport. That contact information is on the screen, and we are looking for that input. So please send that or reach out directly to them. I'd just like to say thank you for your time today. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you for listening.